the more that we recycle and the greater is the efficiency of recycling, the less we require new or virgin resources to maintain the stock of wealth that makes up the economy. Now, that doesn't mean we can continue to recycle matter and energy. It just means that some of the goods that make up the economy before they go out as waste still embody useful resources, and we can recycle some of that, which means we don't have to require as many virgin resources, so we don't have to exploit the environment as much. But of course there's a limit on how much we can recycle. It depends, I think I missed a point here, the efficiency of resource use. And the reason for that is because, in fact, resources through production are turned into physical goods, but some of it becomes immediate waste. Some of it immediately becomes waste. So not all the matter and energy that's embodied in resources goes into physical goods. Some of it immediately becomes waste. Just go to any factory floor and you'll see that's waste that's on the floor. Some of it can be recycled, but not all of it gets embodied in physical goods. If we can increase the efficiency of resource use, it means for a given throughput of matter and energy, input of resources, output of waste, we can sustain a larger economy. So we can have a larger steady state economy. And it of course depends upon the durability of physical goods. Okay, the more durable goods are, the less, or more slowly they wear out and depreciate, and the less new goods we require to produce in order to maintain the stock of wealth intact, lower is the rate of throughput. But the important thing is that we still have this throughput of matter and energy, input of resources, output of waste, even with a steady state economy. In the case of a growth economy, which is the sort of economy we have at present, where the economy is continuously expanding, well, up to a point anyway. I mean, it's only expanding because it can, but eventually it won't be able to. The resource input must exceed the waste output. Now, strictly speaking, resource input must equal waste output. And I won't go into the first and second laws of thermodynamics, but the first law is the conservation of matter and energy, and it means that you can't destroy or create matter and energy. But resources in can, at a single point in time, can exceed the amount coming out, because for a moment in time, some of the matter and energy embodied in those resources is sort of frozen or locked up in physical goods. Right? So the matter and energy that was in the resources that went to produce this stand hasn't become waste immediately because it's locked up in this particular stand. But eventually this will depreciate, become waste, and it will exit the economy. So R does equal W ultimately, but at a single point in time, it need not. In the case of a growth economy, so in other words, for an economy to keep growing, it's not only necessary for R to be greater than W in the short run in order to accumulate goods, but the rate of resource use has to increase over time, which means the amount of waste is going to have to increase over time. So in the case of a growth economy, can't help, even if you use resources more efficiently and so on, greater recycling and what have you, this throughput has to increase. It will increase. With a steady state economy, it need not, and we can actually reduce it by maintaining the economy at the same physical size. Now, you just bear with me. I know this sounds a bit theoretical and what have you at the moment, but I'm leading up to stuff, and then I'll show where we are in relation to this with some empirical evidence. Okay, the other thing is that resources come from one source only, the ecosphere or natural capital or natural environment. So it doesn't come from the economy. Resources only come from the environment. Two types of natural capital. There's non-renewable natural capital, which can only be used once, in a sense. So the long-term reliance is clearly unsustainable. If we're relying upon non-renewable resources to produce our goods and services, then we cannot sustain the physical scale of the economy. We're ultimately dependent upon renewable resources. But we can only use them sustainably in the long term, provided that the rate of extraction, the rate at which we harvest timber from forests or plantations, or we harvest fish from the seas and what have you, is less than or equal to the rate of regeneration. Thanks. So as long as we're extracting timber no greater than the rate it regenerates, we can extract timber forever. Because then there's a question of what forest we're logging from or what have you, which is another issue, but I'll talk about that a bit later too. But if the continued growth of the economy requires the rate of resource input to increase, then at some point the resources required or extracted must exceed the regeneration rate of renewable natural capital. So we may be at a point in time when the economy is growing, keep going in the wrong direction, so this economy may be getting bigger, which means more is going through from, in terms of resources in, waste going out. It may be sustainable for a while, but eventually that rate of throughput, at least in terms of resource input, will get to the point where that cannot be sustained by renewable resources alone. That the rate at which we have to extract resources for resources to go into the economy from the environment will exceed the regeneration rate of renewable natural capital, in which case the economy will no longer be sustainable in the long run. You'll just keep depleting your forests, your fisheries and so on until such time as the economy collapses. Okay. All right. Okay, now since resource input eventually becomes waste output, it is possible in the meantime for the quantity of waste to exceed the waste assimilative capacity of the natural environment. So we not only have to look at and think about the rate at which we're extracting resources and whether or not it's exceeding the regeneration rate, but in the meantime, it is possible that the rate at which wastes are exiting the economy back to the environment could be exceeding the ability of the natural environment to safely absorb and assimilate those wastes and turn them back into useful resources. Right? They don't necessarily occur at the same time. We could harvest a forest at an unsustainable rate prior to the waste being generated exceeding the waste assimilative capacity of the environment, or it could be the other way around. We could actually be harvesting a forest sustainably, but increasing the rate at which we're extracting timber, and the waste being generated could exceed the waste assimilative capacity of the natural environment. Now, I point that out because in the early 1970s, when there was talk about limits to growth, most of the focus of attention was on that resource side. Now, are we going to run out of this or are we going to run out of that? Now, of course, it's focused on the waste side, the output side. Most of our environmental problems are not necessarily, well, in Australia, we've got a special case with water to some extent, but to a large extent, most of our global environmental problems are due to problems on the waste side. Global climate change is about waste exceeding the waste assimilative capacity of the environment. We're not running out of copper just yet, and we're not running out of coal, but it's the output of burning coal that's causing all our problems, all our environmental problems, or most of them anyway. So we have to think in terms of waste and also resources being extracted from the environment. But there's another thing that we also have to be thinking about too, and that is the life support services provided by natural capital. Natural capital, the natural environment just doesn't provide a source of resources and sinks to assimilate our waste, but provide critical life support services that keep us and everything else alive. We have to think about that as well. So there are three critical services provided by natural capital: a source of resources, sink to assimilate waste, and ecosystems to provide these critical life support services. And to operate sustainably, we have to make sure that we keep those services intact. It means we cannot extract resources beyond the regeneration rate of natural capital. We can't create waste greater than the natural environment can assimilate waste, and we cannot destroy ecosystems that provide our critical life support services. So here I've got, it's a bit of a gross simplification, but there's those 3 points there. What's required to operate sustainably? R less than or equal to the regeneration rate, waste less than or equal to the ecosphere's waste assimilative capacity, enough ecosystems to be set aside to maintain critical life support services. If the economy continues to grow, given that the throughput has to keep going up, it means that at least one of these sustainability precepts will be violated. In fact, eventually all three, but one will be violated first. And at that point, the growth of the economy becomes unsustainable. So a sensible risk-averse policy would be to keep natural capital intact, aim for zero population growth and therefore a steady state economy, and preserve and rehabilitate, if it's possible, critical ecosystems. So that hasn't exactly answered question number one, how big can it get? At least it gives us some guidelines as to what we should do to make sure the economy's not too big.